this. I've had a few questions about recording it. So I'll just get that sorted. Okay, Alex, can you see, is that still on? Yeah, as it was.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today, especially to some of our international contributors who have either got up super early or stayed up super late to be with us today. So from Alex and I, for all people that have logged on, and also some of our academic contributors, we are hugely grateful for your time today. So we want to start with, I guess, initially just reminding you guys of how today's going to work. So Alex and I are just going to spend about 10 minutes kind of setting the scene for why we wanted to edit a book such as this and some of our kind of ideas behind it. And then we're really lucky to have 4 contributors today who wrote chapters in the book. So they're going to talk through some of those ideas in their specific chapters. And then most of the contributors are able to stay on for what we've called a contributor roundtable discussion. So with that in mind, any questions that you may have during the course of the presentations, feel free to put them in the chat box. But for most of those questions, we will pick them up during the roundtable discussion. The presenters will have access to the chat box, so they will be able to see questions coming in. So if there's something specific to one of those particular contributors, it's kind of, if they've got the opportunity to, they will attempt to address that, but we will be doing kind of a bigger discussion at the end as a big group. And then from the attendees, obviously, Emerald have given us a copy of the book today, so we'll be able to give that away, but that'll probably be something that we will have to do at the end. And we'll email that around. So I don't think we'll have time for that per se, mainly because I haven't figured out how I'm going to do that. I was going to have all little bits of paper, but there you go. So with that in mind, I'm going to make a start. And I guess the start of this project for Alex and I was very much around our own interest in professional sport. Alex used to play professional sport, and we wanted to pull together this emerging space around research into either professional women's sport or these processes of professionalisation. So we framed it against a backdrop of what's been called a boom of women's sport. It's been kind of written about extensively. And a couple of our key aims for pulling these ideas together were to document and critique the increasing professionalisation that's seen in some women's sport, and a recognition that this process is happening at different paces in different places and across different sports and contexts, but also to outline some of the nuances involved for women as professional athletes and highlight that actually it's a complex space for women carving out a career in this male-dominated space, and there are lots of kind of challenges associated with that, coupled with that kind of, I guess, positive development and growth that we've also seen. So the roots of, or what we wrote about in our introduction chapter, was very much around some of the kind of common discussions that we see around women's sport, especially in the field of sociology of sport and the social sciences. And one of those kind of key ideas is that sport is this masculine, male-dominated space, and it has been since, I guess, the 18th century and maybe even before. So it's a common held idea within the social sciences that sport is a gendered institution, and it's something that's been created by and for men. And that has made, historically, women's involvement in sport problematic. Now, I'm speaking here in quite catch-all terms. Obviously, there are examples of really successful women in sport throughout history. There have been success stories around women's involvement in sport for a long time. So this is by no means a one story that fits all experience, but this is kind of the general sense that we get. That's coupled with what's been called the frailty myth, which is very much rooted in kind of Victorian ideologies about what it means to be a woman, or what perhaps women can and can't do physically. So that started with kind of medical ideas of female frailty, and that centered on women and menstruating initially. But also these ideas and ideologies centered on kind of a middle class, typically white woman, and a woman that, as we moved into the 20th century, a woman that raised children and looked after the home. which contradicts a lot of some of those expected behaviours that we see in sport. So women's presence in sport has then been seen as, or quite often talked about as, quite transformative, with the potential to perhaps subvert or change some of these gender norms that had become rooted in society. And then we kind of drew forward into looking at women in professional sport and probably recognising that there's a longer history than maybe that's been given credit for. One of the chapters in the book that isn't discussed today by Susan Ryder, sorry, she's now married, looked at women in professional cycling and talked about women being paid to take part in cycling as early as the 19th century. And then there's been some standout moments, particularly in America, and as you can see on the bottom of the screen, of examples where women have been paid to play sport. So the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League in the 40s, the LPGA in the 50s, tennis in the 70s, all the way up to the successes and failures of basketball and soccer in the late 20th century, early 21st century. So the history of women's involvement in sport at a professional level is quite sporadic, but there have been examples over time. So we pulled together some key terms. We don't really need to go through them with you here per se, but we talked about this process of professionalisation as being one that is inherently tied to ideas of gender within women's sport, but that what it involves in is this increasing formalisation of women's sport, whether that's in policy, contracts, etc., and that to be seen as a professional athlete, women were being financially remunerated. So that was something that we drew upon, and something me and Alex were quite keen to flag was that to be considered a professional sportswoman, we wanted that to be something that enabled them to be able to commit full time, and I think that's something that has been problematic for women. So handing over to Al then in terms of contemporary issues.
Thank you, Al. Yeah, so just to echo Ali's early thoughts, that we're really happy that everyone can be here. It's kind of like I suppose a celebration of everybody's hard work to put this book together, and it was Ali and I's first opportunity to do an edited book, and it's been a roller coaster to say the least. But I think like this roundtable discussion is a celebration of that. So again, extended thank you to everyone for being here. So just to continue then in a contemporary sense of what Ali's highlighted so far is, I guess the idea behind the book was to kind of document and critique these common myths that we hear around women's sport, that it's just an extension of men's sport, and that, you know, you kind of, I think it was the famous saying like, add women and stir, and Ali and I were keen to get away from that and document something that was really I suppose individualized away from men's sport, and to document the growth and development. So first of all, I suppose a contemporary issue is the media coverage, growth and lack thereof, and what we identify in the book, and what the chapters identify in the book, and obviously what wider research identifies, is that the media coverage of women's sport is absolutely integral to the development of the sport, but there's a disparity between what we see in coverage and the type of representation that we see. So, you know, very misogynistic, sexist representation of women's sport and questioning of women's athletic capabilities. And I think it's something that's really important, and a theme that is throughout women's sport that we should highlight and really highlight within the book. So moving on to the online media then. Online media and digital platforms, again, is something that's absolutely essential for the growth of women's sport, and it's give women an opportunity to carve out a space in a overcrowded hegemonic masculinity space. So I think online media and the growth and labour are really important, but then there's this issue around online media of accessibility and women's additional labour, something that they're not remunerated for directly, I guess, but they use it as a platform to gain remuneration and economic stability in a career that's very short and really fragile. And as we've highlighted in the book, there's then the problem of online abuse, which emerges as well, and we don't just see that obviously in women's sport. It's online digital platforms are really a space where you want to use a better phrase, trolls can really abuse minorities in sport, whether that be on the back of gender or race or any other minority characteristic. So I think that is, an issue that is contemporary and is continuing to grow. And I think we're only scratching the surface really with what that means for women and professional athletes in women's sport specifically. Employment, this is one of the key themes throughout the book. I think it is really keen to say that the formalisation of contracts for women means that athletes are now paid to play professional sport, and I think that's something that's really significant, and it should be celebrated that we are in an era now where women are paid to play. However, we have, as academics and people who work within sport, it's really important that we critique that and understand what that means for players. And like Ali said before, the formalisation of contracts doesn't mean that players are just paid bits and bobs and drips and drabs, and they have to do other things really to subsidise their work in professional sport. If they're a professional athlete, they are professional athletes and paid to do so as a sole form of employment. And tied into this kind of form of formal employment is the grateful narrative. So, it's not just research documented within this book. There's broader research as well that suggests that women are really tied to employment, but they're very, they're afraid to rock the boat, and they're grateful for the opportunity to even perform in this professional sport arena. And it's more about women given this opportunity rather than one that they've earned. And I think that's really a key consideration as we consider women as paid athletes. Talking more about employment then, there's an increase in pressure and expectations. This ties in, I think, quite neatly and quite importantly to the growth of online media as well. And the increase in pressure and expectations, players and athletes and people who work within sport quite generally are not prepared for the increased expectations and what it actually means to be a professional athlete. I think it's one thing saying you're a professional athlete and being paid to perform on a professional stage, but what does that actually mean in terms of increased pressure and expectation? Again, another key term that ties neatly throughout the book, and Ali and I's research more broadly, is the precariousness of employment in sport, and I think that shines through in every chapter, whether that's a transition, so going from amateur to professional, semi-professional sport, or actually at the elite end of the game in the professional sense as well. There is a precarity associated with being a female athlete based purely or increasingly so because of gender. And then more specifically, the gender-specific requirements of employment. I think this is really overlooked by organisations and clubs who surround sport, that actually what do women need as athletes, and we're very keen to make the distinction between what women need and what men need in terms of not only like the reproductive system but more so about the science behind what constitutes to be a female athlete. And then really importantly to note, last but not least, the way that sport privileges certain women. So part of the theme of the book was to highlight the intersectionality of women athletes who experience discrimination within sport, and how white middle-class women are almost always privileged within sport. So yeah, that's a touching the tip of the iceberg, I guess, on the contemporary issues.
So obviously in true academic fashion we've already gone over, but we are now absolutely delighted to hand over to Emma, who's going to build on some of those things that Al's just talked about, actually, in terms of social media abuse, and talk through some of the key ideas from her chapter contribution along with her colleagues. So Emma, I'm going to stop presenting and hopefully you're all up, and I'm going to turn my face off and my mic off.
Right. Thanks so much, and firstly thank you to both of you for allowing us to contribute to this book. You know, I'm always really excited to write and get my research out there, but to do so with such incredible academics and in a space that I think is so important makes it all the more special. But I'm not just presenting on behalf of myself today. I'm also presenting on behalf of Dr. Jacqueline Osborne and Dr. Chelsea Litchfield from Charles Sturt University in Australia. And you know, again, it speaks to having great colleagues that you can work with and do really critical work, but also become friends in the process. And I look at, we were finishing this chapter at the time that I became a first-time mum, you know, a really critical point in my career, and having strong women around you that support you is so important. So what's our chapter about? It's chapter 10, which makes me excited because it's my old playing number, but it's called Freedom for Expression or a Space of Oppression, and it's looking at social media and the rise of the digitized female athlete. And there's some light and dark in here, because I tend to shift to the dark and really look at how virtual environments have created a space where abuse can occur. But really where Chelsea and Jackie offer some light in this chapter is looking at the fact that, come on, like, virtual environments have been an absolute game changer. They've been a game changer in the world anyway, but certainly the world of sport and women's sport. Look at us now. We've got a team of people from across the globe, and people sat at different corners of the world, and technology has made it possible to connect. Like, most of us now spend a lot of our time on one of these. We connect, we interact, we've got to the point where we don't really know where the online and the offline world start or stop. So they have been a game changer. And for the women athlete, well, they've become a place of expression. You know, the chance to be able to share your own content, present yourself to fans or followers, gain brand ambassadors, be a digitized athlete. You know, we know that the space is changing, and we're connecting in social media and virtual worlds in a way that we didn't. So previously, these are places of self-presentation, a place of empowerment, being able to hold your own narrative and present yourself as you want to. So potentially bypassing some of the traditional gatekeepers that have been in place before to women's sport. We've also seen more recently the reclamation of power and collective voice within virtual spaces, certainly around some of the narratives on abuse as example in sport. So what happens when we can collectively join together and have our voices heard in spaces that weren't there before? So of course there is light. But where the chapter really moves into is looking at some of the risks that go alongside that. Lives spent more online, how that's changing our behaviour, but also how the internet poses threats. And in lots of ways, it can serve to enable abuse rather than keep us safe. Now, just to say where this research came from, my research really looked at athletes that had experienced abuse or interpersonal violence in face-to-face settings. And I went into that research like anyone, you know, thinking about the coach-athlete relationship. And suddenly what I was hearing from the athletes I was working with is, okay, that's one thing, but now, you know, I have an online following, an online presence. There's a whole, you know, the game is surrounding me all the time. People can comment, people can contact me. So actually what I'm dealing with goes far beyond the reaches of the court, the pitch, the field, and these environments are changing the way in which I interact and view myself. So that what we really talk about then is what is virtual violence? And I'm calling it that for a reason, because often we talk about trolls and trolling. And yes, there is such a thing as trolling. If you work in online environments, we have to embrace the more than human actors within this, the bots, the complex algorithms. But often when we're talking about violence in virtual spaces that athletes experience, it's the fans, it's the people involved in the online social commentary surrounding sport that then goes online and doesn't just stay in the stadiums or doesn't just stay on the court or pitch. So it's the type of behaviour that athletes can receive either directly or indirectly that can include discriminatory language, threats of physical violence, sexually suggestive language. It can lead to wide-ranging upset for the athletes, and they can see it directly. Like, this can be a one-off hateful comment through to far more targeted systematic, pervasive examples of abuse. And as we've seen in recent discussions where athletes have been talking out about the violence that they experience in online platforms, it's not just them, it's not just threats against themselves, it can extend to their family members, their teammates. It can be from the minor comments or things that people would argue were said in jest right the way through to acts that are extremely violent and might well extend into their physical space or threaten their physical safety. I'm being really fortunate to host a panel next year looking at female scientists that have been abused online due to them speaking out about COVID. And it really reminded me in this to talk about the fact that, yes, it might happen online, but actually it can extend to our feelings of safety within the physical realm as well. So again, going back to where does the online and offline stop? Well, so why athletes as targets? You know, for much of the reason that other people might target violence, they might have very public profiles, they can be followed, watched. We want athletes, especially women athletes, to be brand ambassadors, to have an online presence. But that means that we open ourselves up to the public opinion. We put ourselves out there and it makes us reachable, contactable. There's an ease of online contact. And we've seen that violence online can happen for a variety of reasons. Maybe my performance doesn't meet your expectations. I might not meet the societal norms, or I might not fit into your expectations. I might be an outlier, so I might overperform or underperform. I might look a certain way or not look a certain way. The reality is that there is a variety of reasons why someone might experience or be a target of violence online. But certainly, and I think where this book chapter really allowed us the chance to discuss it, is that we see that women more often than not experience violence online, that much of the violence that they experience is gender-based and happens because they are women, but also lies at the intersections of other elements of their identity that increases the risk of the type of violence that they might experience. So really, as much as I talk about the joy of this platform, social media does provide a space for unregulated gender-based violence that can target women, and especially high-profile women, in their workplace in a way that we haven't necessarily seen in traditional sports media. We also in the chapter talk about the impact, and I think that's where I've been really fortunate in my role working as a sports psychologist to see, well, I am hearing about this more in terms of the preparation of athletes, the ability to switch off, you know, where actually it starts and stops. And it's too easy to say, well, hey, don't come offline, don't use it, because as we've said, there's so many benefits and sport is changing. But often virtual violence will be unnoticed because, you know, it's just words on a screen. It doesn't matter, or it isn't real. But we know that it can have significant consequences on performers and on people around them. Based on accounts from our research so far, we can see a psychological, behavioural and performance effect of this type of violence, but also that it can lead into a cascade and escalate into other areas of victims' lives. And while some people navigate with, adjust to and respond to this violence relatively well, for others, the impact of it can be highly significant and damaging. Well, why is there increased risk? Well, we're all spending loads more time online, not just through COVID, but anyway, because our lives are spent online. But there's also, as we know, a lack of regulation in these spaces. There's the likelihood to interact with strangers or people that we don't or never will meet in physical space, and a feeling of presumed intimacy, the bastion of freedom of speech, that it doesn't matter, the development of parasocial relationships. The fact that now we don't necessarily understand the nature of what is truth, what is real news, and the difficulty in policing these spaces, which means that they cannot be ignored. We've got to ask critical questions about making these places safer, but also looking at how we educate, protect, respond to, go through media training for athletes, and especially women athletes navigating these spaces. I'm going to have a shout out, I think, because there's a colleague on this call today from the Netball Players Association who've done some really fantastic work with the PPF on just developing some social media guidance and some guidance for athletes to better protect themselves in response to the fact that we're seeing far more violent interactions towards athletes in the online environment. So where's the next steps? As we become increasingly more professional, there's an expectation for athletes to be visible on social media, but we have to be aware of the fact that that can pose risks. There's emotional labour, there's labour associated with being online, and it is a delicate balance. Whilst we're obliged to navigate these online spaces, we can use them for a vehicle of self-empowerment. We have to be aware of how to protect ourselves within them as well. And I'm certainly excited to move this forward and to work more to keep people safer in virtual spaces. Thanks, Ali.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. That was super engaging, super interesting. So I really appreciate that. Just quite conscious, actually, we're not going to have Emma for the round table. So unfortunately, Emma probably won't be able to answer any questions in the round table about online abuse, but Alex and I will do our very best to answer on your behalf, if that's okay, Emma. So just a reminder, if you do have any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll most very likely be picking them up in the round table at 1. So I want to introduce, thank you, Emma, by the way, I want to introduce Tracy Taylor, Professor Tracy Taylor, to come and do her presentation. We are hugely grateful that Tracy has stayed up really late in Australia to be with us today. And she is going to be presenting on her chapter on rugby league in Australia. So I will hand over to Tracy.
Thanks, Ali and Alex. And there's no way I'm going to be able to match Emma's energy at this time of night. Changing tack a little bit with this presentation as well. So I want to start by saying Wominjeka. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the universities that the research team comes from, and that's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we exist, and to acknowledge traditional owners past and present. I would also like to acknowledge and note that our chapter is part of a series of research funding that was secured through the NRL, and we were very fortunate for the National Rugby League to recognize that they would like to bring in some researchers before they commence their inaugural rugby league competition for women. And I'll talk a little bit about why that was founded when it was founded. So as is outlined in the book, and I think as we heard from the introduction, this space of women in semi-professional and professional sport is a really exciting area to be looking at the moment. And it has a lot of challenges and presents a lot of opportunities as well. We were particularly looking at rugby league in Australia and New Zealand because we wanted to investigate a sport where women have traditionally played in national teams. So in the case of rugby league, in Australia and New Zealand, the Australian team or the New Zealand team, but we're not paid for that playing in those national teams. But now we're given the opportunity through the emergence of a national competition and teams within that competition to start moving towards being professional, or as we say, to professionalizing. And particularly investigating whether or not the opportunities that they were being presented were equitable across a range of dimensions, remuneration being one of those, resourcing, support, access to training, to facilities, to both off the field and on the field supports. Looking at aspects about in moving to a new competition, what would employment security look like? And what opportunities would it provide for career development or career pathways? And I will also say that a lot of what we're discussing and what's in the book is focused specifically in the countries that comprise the global north. And I recognize that in the work that we're doing. So as many people, I suppose, on this call would know, that in rugby league, particularly Australia and New Zealand, the opportunity to pursue a professional or semi-professional career for many years was limited to men. And in the landscape which we see women's sport existing in Australia and New Zealand at the moment, there's been a lot of opportunities created for existing leagues to grow in other sports and for new sports to enter with women's competitions. And in some sports, the emergence of these competitions has been because of public and community pressure, and to an extent because sponsors have been looking to these sport organizations to create a women's version of a national league. Because, dare I say, a lot of the men's equivalents are filled with boys behaving badly, and they're looking for a different value proposition to align their sponsorship with. So our research looked, and the chapter that we presented looked particularly at the personal, organizational, societal barriers and support practices and measures that were initiated for women coming into the league for the inaugural season and the second season. I can talk a little bit about the third season and the aborted fourth season a bit later. So we looked at, initially, we interviewed players who were assumed to be selected in the 40 initial places for the teams that were forming the first national competition. And when we spoke to those players, they were very keen to intimate to us that they wanted the first year in particular to be a small competition, because they felt that the talent pool would be only sufficient to probably cover at most 4 teams. So the NRL listened to that advice, and season 1 was 4 teams, and season 2 was 4 teams as well. In season 1, and this I think relates back to some of the comments that were made in the introduction. In season 1, the players felt very grateful for the opportunity to be selected and to play in the inaugural competition. They were willing to make incredible financial and family and career sacrifices to be able to engage in that initial competition. It was short, which meant that many of the women playing either used their full annual leave and took time off work to play in that first season, or they, and I don't quite know how this works, but a few people said that they actually took sick leave for those 4 weeks from their work. So I don't know how you could be sick and be playing at the level they were playing, but that did happen, or took time out of their careers or their studies. And they felt that those sacrifices were well worthwhile. And I think that's really consistent with a lot of the other research we see in this space, which details that tension between that overwhelming sense of optimism, of being affirmed in being a professional athlete, is balanced with the tension and frustration about having to juggle competing demands for their time and resources. Particularly, I must say that the women and a significant number of the players had young families, and their husbands and or support people actually moved with them to look after the kids while they played, which was quite a family support network that they had to build up, because not all the clubs provided that. So the players in that first season were really excited, proud, grateful to be part of the new competition. really felt that it was important to be role models, and picking up on Emma's points, very effectively use social media to build their networks and their support networks within the community as well, to engage young girls and get them excited about potentially coming into rugby league, particularly in a lot of the culturally diverse communities. Some of you may know that particularly Indigenous and Pacifica communities are overrepresented in rugby league, both in the men's and the women's games, and that was really important in those communities. But what we see when we move into season 2 is, as these leagues evolve and as players' expectations evolve, even though the level of payment was the same in season 2 as it was in season 1. In season 1, they were quite happy with that level of remuneration and support. In season 2, we start to see a lot of dissatisfaction creeping in, and expectations starting to raise. And I think that is also associated with, at the same time, we're seeing a lot of collective agreements being reached in other sports with women's leagues that are much more lucrative than we see in rugby league. So they're feeling that they're getting a little bit behind, although in respect to rugby union, they're way ahead, and rugby league has actually attracted some players for rugby union. Because in the 15s game, the women still aren't paid in Australia and New Zealand. So dissatisfaction starts to come in about the number of teams, with pressure being put on the NRL to increase the number of teams, to increase the length of the season, so that it is more substantive and provides a bit more legitimacy, to have a greater focus on increasing the media coverage and support and sponsorship for the women's leagues as well. So this level of dissatisfaction starts to accelerate quite dramatically in season 2, and although we don't present a lot of it in the chapter, into season 3 as well. So I guess some of the key takeaways from this for us, because we were working with the NRL, is that the NRL were very intent on listening to the players' voices and trying to improve the organizational culture, the support, the remuneration, and refine the league as they've gone through. And I guess time will tell as we move into subsequent seasons. The other thing that the leagues has done is it has been very affirming. It has been legitimizing around the women's game. For those again who know a little bit about rugby league for girls in Australia, will know that girls used to only be able to play to 12, and then they couldn't play beyond that, and then they had to come back in as adults. So now there's a career pathway. Now there's a lot of second tier and third tier teams that are emerging. It's facilitated an increased interest in the game at the community and grassroots level, more girls participating, and it's put a lot of resources back into developing the women's league. One thing I would say, just to highlight, that each of these franchises was probably about 150,000, 200,000 Australian for the 4 inaugural clubs to start. And they were very disparate in the amount beyond that they put into the women's game. In some of the clubs, all the coaching staff, support staff, etc., were volunteers. And in some of the other clubs, those were all paid positions. So there was quite a bit of variability, even within that small amount of clubs. So I think, as I say, going forward, it will be very interesting. This season has been cancelled, while the NRL Men's League have been able to operate in a bubble, because as everyone probably knows, we've been in and out of lockdown across Australia. The women's game, it was decided that would be moved from 2021 to 2022. New Zealand won't have a team because of border restrictions, and there'll be 3 new teams added. And I know that the number of clubs vying for those new franchises was quite significant, because there is seen as the women's game having a lot of community interest, a lot of interest with sponsors, and a lot of alignment with the brands that Rugby League feels that it wants to stand for. So I think I will end it there. I think that's my time, and happy to take questions when we move to the panel.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and apologies for my comment saying your camera wasn't on. I'm having some technical issues, but I've since been informed that everyone else can see everything, just I can't see anything. So thank you, Tracy. So I want to move quickly on to Hendrik. So Hendrik has joined us from South Africa today and is going to be talking to us, another rugby one, but this time talking to us about South African Rugby Union. So Hendrik, are you good to go?
Thanks, Ali.
Thanks a lot, Hendrik.
Hello to everybody. Yeah, I'm essentially an historian, so my contribution started from an historical angle about a sport that has been played in South Africa since the 1860s, and women only entered rugby union 140 years later. Together, or it coincided basically with South Africa's political transition from apartheid to democracy. And saying that, let me then also immediately add that it doesn't mean that prior to 2001, when the women's game was officially organized, it didn't mean that there was absolutely no females attempting to play the game. During the late 19th century, one of the Port Elizabeth newspapers, for example, recorded a match between the suffragettes and a men's team. Which of course was regarded as an aberration, a funny spectacle, and something that was actually frowned upon, because a lot of the South African rugby football fraternity in the 19th century subscribed to the notion that a man is not a woman. So during the 19th century and the rooting of rugby union in this part of the world, the character of South Africa's new sport was typically male. Clubs were all male, and in the process, you had a situation where women were relegated to the laundry staff. They were tasked with preparing match kit, washing jerseys, ironing, and making sure that their menfolk are properly dressed for their occasions. A secondary consequence of that is that what Farah Palmer used to call men were sort of relegating women to the role of male gazers. So the South African game, like in the rest of the world from the outset, was a sexist game. But it also, because of our colonial past, it also developed a racial character, where white men didn't want to play with black men in the same teams, and it forced the development of two distinct rugby traditions in this country. One exclusively white, and second exclusively black. But they have one thing in common. Both black and white rugby administrators and their respective associations excluded women and continue the practice of relegating women to male gazers and laundry personnel. So, given our colonial past, it was almost inevitable that the development of women's rugby in later years became enmeshed with South Africa's political problems, and later the political transition from a racist apartheid system to a new democracy. So at the beginning of the millennium in 2001, organized women's rugby were formally launched. It started off as an initiative driven by women themselves. And within a short space of time, we had all over the country at least 14 teams. Now, the difficulty with such a spread and it not being confined to one of the 9 provinces or not having a base in all the provinces makes it fairly difficult to properly organize a national league or to play a proper interprovincial competition. Because of the first 13 clubs, 16 was in the Western Cape province around Cape Town. But what is important also for us to understand when we look at the evolution of South African women's rugby is to look at its intersection with some of the fights within the male game. Now, because of the fact that for 110 years, only white males played internationally. Only white males had the right to represent what was then called their South Africa. There was a fight by black rugby administrators and players for about 100 years to have an open game, a merit-based game, a non-racial game, and an inclusive game. So after a fight of 100 years, in 1991, as our political transition to a post-apartheid dispensation started, part of the political compromise was that black men and white men will leave their racial bodies behind and form a new inclusive non-racial South African Rugby Football Union that is neither white, neither black, but South African. And that was it was 2 years before South Africa really find itself in a strong wave of transition towards a new order. 3 years after the last apartheid-based male games were played, South Africans went to a democratic election, which brought Nelson Mandela in as the first all-South African non-racial state president. 3 years after male rugby unified. But in that unification, there was no idea whatsoever of allowing women into the sanctuary. And by the time 10 years later, when the International Rugby Board, now World Rugby, decided to formally support women's rugby internationally, South Africa was obliged as an affiliate member to also promote the women's game. And they were fortunate they could find at least 13 social clubs established by females, organized by themselves, pushing their own agenda that they could embrace. But there was also a counter-reaction from the male rugby fraternity. For them, it was a matter of why are women now beginning to infringe on our territory? Obviously, the standard stereotypes were articulated. Are they butch? Are they Barbie dolls on pitches? What are they doing in an exclusively male republic? It is not suited for them. Despite the example that the game was fruitfully and productively being promoted all over the world. So women's rugby from the outset find itself in the cauldron of South Africa's political transition. And what complicated the issue further was the fact that societal changes that were politically driven at that time constantly interfere with the growth of the game. For example, the ejection of white males from political power in 1994 created a lot of resentment within the white rugby fraternity. In addition to that, South Africa embraced a notion of non-discrimination with regards to sex and sexual orientation. So being gay and having equal rights, and gays actively beginning to promote their interest strongly over a wide front, created what one sports scientist called, it created a crisis of masculinity for white South Africans in particular. Because the creation of a situation where women starts to play rugby now, they have all equality under the law, and the Equality Court makes sure that there is no discrimination whatsoever. The fact that women were beginning to occupy seats in provincial and national parliament, occupying the role of speakers in particular. The fact that a large percentage of the South African government and ministers became female didn't go down with a lot of males. So there was a very strong reaction amongst the white male rugby fraternity in particular, because in their world, women are supposed to be mothers of the nation. Or as we say in Afrikaans, they are supposed to be volksmoeders, the nurturers and carers of the nation. But there was also the ongoing fight between white males and black males about opportunity and the right to represent South Africa equally and on merit when it comes to playing on the international circuit. So we had a situation where the whole issue of the racial or demographic transformation of the national team, the Springboks, were dominating the media, dominating proceedings within rugby, and created a lot of animosity within the media and the rugby supporting public that were used to the national rugby team, the Springboks, always have been a majority white team, despite white people being an absolute demographic minority in South Africa. So when women entered the domain of rugby and black men still engaged their white counterparts about the right to fair representation and opportunity, the outlook for female players were very, very poor. Despite that, those involved with the women's game continued to organize. And soon we saw the progression from club rugby into provincial rugby. And finally, by 2004, 2005, the establishment of a national team, the Springboks for women's rugby, and the team being baptized the Lady Box or the Women's Springboks, equal in status, or so we thought, and so a lot of people thought, to their male counterparts, the Springboks.
Hendrik, sorry, just could you try and wrap up, please? Sorry, thank you.
Yes. For the next 10 to 15 years, the women's team struggled to establish a reputation, to lay down their own legacy, to create their own folklore, legends, and heroes. While they do it in a part-time fashion, with only a daily allowance or a match fee, they were not really included into the Professional Players Association. And when the first bankruptcy hit, the male version of the game and mitigation matters were investigated, men were the only ones considered. Females were excluded. When COVID came and we had a very hard lockdown, men went into the bubble, the women's game was abandoned. It's only starting to revive right now. So women rugby players in South Africa already had a battle. They were excluded from the last Olympics because the notion was that they had no realistic chance of winning. Their fight continues even today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hendrik. Sorry for interjecting. I did try and catch you on the chat, but really appreciate
No problem.
appreciate your contribution. Super interesting as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to our last presenter, which is Robbie. So Robbie's joined us from America, so he's got up very early this morning. So over to you, Robbie.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. Happy to be here. And yeah, I was just thinking back to Ali and I actually wrote the chapter for the book together, and chapter title Sexism and Racism in the women's professional golf, the 2019 US Open. And thinking back to our initial discussions on how we wanted to approach this, the professionalization of women's golf, it was kind of difficult to conceptualize it in such a small space. And I believe when we were in the ideation process, this event kind of, fortunately or unfortunately, fell in our laps. And I'll touch on kind of how we frame the chapter and how it's representative of what we've kind of seen with women's golf over time. And so I think that was kind of our focus, is like, how can we take a microcosm or a one-off type of situation, and how is that indicative of what we've seen in women's golf over time? And so to give some background, women's golf has kind of a marred past. They have been involved in the game since its early beginnings, but there's always been certain areas and aspects of exclusion, whether that's access to facilities on site, whether that's restricted playing times, whether that was historically what clothing could be worn on the course. We often still see that today. I believe last year the LPGA even instituted a rule on a certain type of skirt that the players could be wearing. And so women's golf, when it traveled overseas, I'll say to America in the late 1800s, women did have access to play in tournaments, but even then they were still registering under their husband's name. And then as we kind of moved along, we saw the formation of the Women's Professional Golf Association in the 1940s, 1950s, and that eventually went defunct. But the LPGA, the Ladies Professional Golf Association, which we could get into the use of ladies in the title, but it's the longest running professional sport organization for women in the world. In those early days often looked like traveling around in big groups, kind of low money tournaments playing, and kind of struggling which I'm sure you'll see in a lot of the other chapters, just to make a living in the sport. Kind of fast forward today, it is one of the more lucrative sports for women to be playing in. In 2019, 14 players eclipsed the $1 million US dollar earning mark on course, not counting sponsorships and other opportunities. But even going back just a little bit, when the LPGA first got started, we really saw it as this tour and organization that was centered around white heteronormative players. And that was kind of the feel of the tour and how it was presented to consumers. Once the tour started becoming a little more global, we saw the introduction of players like Sayri Pak, Annika Sorenstam, Lorena Ochoa, and we were starting to get this dispersion in kind of more global reach of the game. Sayri Pak is notable in the sense that it kind of ushered in this wave of Asian players in general, but Korean players specifically to, what we see today. Maybe 4 of the top 5 players in the world are Korean. And so with Sayri Pak, behind her came Yanni Sang from Chinese Taipei, Aimi Azato from Japan. And really we were starting to see this renaissance on tour where it was looking more diverse. And that did not come without controversy and players not being exactly welcomed into the sport. Jan Stevenson, an Australian player, back in the day when she was announcing, had notably said that the Asians are killing our tour. And so there was kind of this defense of it being this white heteronormative tour that you needed to conform to be able to play. Further, the LPGA in general had kind of stepped in it a lot of times over the years. They had tried different strategies to make the tour more approachable, to try and grow it from a sponsorship and dollar standpoint. A couple notable instances, one being a marketing campaign called the 5 Points of Celebrity, where one of those 5 points was to use sexualization and to present the players as attractive hetero females to try and kind of usher in a male audience. And then a little bit more down the road, we saw the almost implementation of an English speaking rule. So after some notable Asian players were winning tournaments and they were doing after the round pressers and they were speaking in Korean or whatever their native language was, the tour saw that as kind of a threat to the long-term health. So they almost instituted an English speaking rule where players would have to learn English, give the interviews in English, or they would be penalized and potentially suspended from the tour. This is all happening while the Asian market is substantially growing. It's even buoying the tour in 2011 when it almost went under as far as the sponsorship, where tournaments are being played around the world. And so there's this very conflicting past with women's professional golf, that it is a very lucrative opportunity, but it does not come without its difficulties, particularly for players from Asia. And so moving on to where we centered the chapter around, we looked at the 2019 US Women's Open. There was an incident that occurred where a longtime golf coach Hank Haney and his co-host Steve Johnson were hosting their weekly prediction show and giving who they would believe to be the winners on the PGA Tour. Steve Johnson kind of at the end of the show kind of sheepishly mentions that the US Women's Open is being played. And Hank Haney says, I'm going to predict a Korean. And then further goes on to say, I couldn't name 6 players on tour, but I'd pick a Lee. That's who I would pick. And so while this is happening, while they go on break, there's backlash from the golf community, from the players, from the LPGA. They come back on air, and Hank Haney defends his decision by saying that there's a lot of players named Lee. They go, Lee 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so Hank Haney's eventually suspended from the show and eventually fired. And so what we did is we looked at the US media reports and how they covered the incident. And so notably, we took about 25 news articles, about half of them pre-tournament and half of them post-tournament. We looked at the headlines and we also looked at the content within those articles, and we saw some interesting things that are probably transferable to a lot of the other sports that are talked about in the book. But the first thing that we saw was this kind of downplaying of the remarks. So we found that it was hard for reporters for some reason to properly frame how the incident went down. A lot of them would use language like controversial comments, disparaging comments, racially charged comments, but no one overtly would call out that Hank Haney was being racist. Another thing that we saw was this ambivalence to the women's game. So either glossing over the incident in headlines, or if they were mentioning the winner of the tournament, John Young Lee 6, it was only after it was preceded by Hank Haney's name. So we saw this as a sort of subordinate positioning of women in the game. And probably the most troubling that we found was this overutilization of wire reports. So now that this incident had caught international or national attention, news organizations that don't have anyone actually dedicated to cover women's golf were starting to just kind of copy and paste or reproduce these wire reports. And there was really no nuance to it. No one was really trying to dig into the undertones and kind of background of what this really meant for the golfing community. Excuse me. And then another thing that we found was this privileging of men. We saw that Hank Haney is most notably known as Tiger Woods' golf coach for many years. And there was sort of this framing that excused Haney's actions or kind of gave him this cover or like symbolic capital, that they would describe the incident, but at the same time, they would first preface it with his background, with his accolades, and sort of bury the lead of what was really happening with the event. And then the last thing that we saw was this global tour and kind of global support from the LPGA players, from the LPGA tour, coming to the defense of the diversity of the tour and it being one of the biggest strengths. The population of young women is the fastest growing in the sport of golf in general. We now see events like the UL International Crown, where it is 4 countries each other in sort of a adjustment from what we see in the typical Ryder Cup or Solheim Cup, where it's the US versus Europe. So there's really this inclusion and effort to make the tour more global, and that's mostly at the behest of former commissioner, now Mike Wan, and seeing the opportunity that comes with having that diversity, that inclusion in that Asian market. And so I think that where we kind of go from here and what's happened post-COVID is that we're seeing golf and the LPGA kind of continually gather more popularity. But we still see this confliction of like the old guard of golf, which, you know, in the sense could be symbolic of like Hank Haney's interactions, kind of the old white male, and this space that's kind of privileged and protected for them. And then anyone that's seen as the other, and in this case, Asian women coming in and playing well in the sport, can kind of be a threat to that old guard. But I'm gonna stop there because I know we're kind of hurting on time a little bit, but happy to answer any follow-ups or give more context in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Robbie, by the way. Nice discussion of the chapter that me and you wrote, so much appreciated. So again, conscious of time and conscious of our international contributors as well, we're going to move straight into what I've called the roundtable discussion. So if all contributors, so Alex, Tracy, I know we've lost Emma for teach, she's gone to teach, but Robbie and Hendrik, just want to pop cameras back on, and I think we've got a couple of questions that we want to go through as a group anyway, but if anyone's got any specific questions or things that you want us to talk about, please just use the chat box. We can all see it. But I think we'll start with, and it's an open forum, so I can't see anyone's screens, by the way, so you guys just go ahead. Al, I don't know if you want to kind of moderate from a screen perspective. But the sort of first question that is something that Tracy proposed as we were pulling this seminar together was, what's the postscript to our contributions to the book? So what's happened next, or or what's kind of the future looking like. So we had these ideas and started pulling these together nearly 2 years ago now, and lots of things have changed. So where do we go from here? And I'll just open that up to the floor, really.
I can start.
Thanks, Tracy.
So I think I alluded to, in particular, around the topic of the chapter, which in our case is the National Rugby League, the women's competition. It seemed to be really gaining momentum and ramping up, and then COVID hit. And so, similar to what we heard from Hendrik, the women didn't get the bubble, the men did. Dare I say, the men that did get the bubble did a whole bunch of things in that bubble they shouldn't have done. So that competition has been put on hold. But if we look more generally, and I'll speak about the Australian sporting landscape, we've seen record after record set with the enterprise agreements that have been rolled out in football for women, in cricket for women, in netball, in basketball. So there's a lot of good news stories that are coming out, and I think that there's more. There's certainly challenges, and I think every speaker alluded to some racist or sexist commentary from an Australian or a in the Australian sporting context, but it is really gaining momentum, and I think we're at a critical point here in women's sport, and a recognition, as I think was alluded to in the first couple of introductory comments, that the way we value, the way we position, the way we support our women's leagues doesn't have to look the same way as men's competitions.
I can go next. I think that maybe more broadly to women's professional golf is that there's always this struggle for higher pay, right? For tournament purses to be paying more, for the women to be rewarded for the skill that they have, and so on and so forth. And recently the LPGA has decided to move their first major of the year, which was the ANA Inspiration, that's been held at the same course for almost 50 years, kind of the equivalent of the Masters for the men. They've brought on a new title sponsor. They're going to move the tournament out to Houston. And so there's this kind of struggle as, like, do we sell out our history to a certain extent for a 3-year title sponsor and increase purses? Is that the best move for women's golf and continued professionalization and growth of the game? Or is there, another option that should have been considered as far as keeping the tournament there, working to try and secure that same money for the women? And so I think we're seeing this massive growth happening, but it's difficult to steer it in the right direction. I think another area that we see it is with Gulf Saudi being extremely prevalent in a lot of the tournaments, and a lot of players taking on sponsorships. And so it's kind of this juxtaposition of, them doing well, getting sponsorship money, but kind of at what cost as well, as far as like socially, and if we're thinking about larger women's rights and how that all plays in. So it's extremely complex, it's tangled. Women's golf in general is in a great place. I think it's moving in the right direction, but there's always these subsets of issues that seem to be playing into the decisions and how it's going to look in the future.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks, Tracy, for that. I think those two comments, I'm going to kind of go into the second question that we had sort of prepared anyway. And I think they lead really nicely from the stuff that Robbie and Tracy have both contributed there. But we've all talked about in various forms of the discussions of the chapters, what potential contemporary issues in women's sport. So are there any examples where those contemporary issues have been addressed, or we're seeing progress in I think Emma alluded to the Netball Players Association and the work they're doing around online abuse. But I don't know if Alex, you can speak to anything in terms of your research in football, but what contemporary issues are being addressed, or where might there be sort of further investigation, I guess?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. That so I think specifically in women's football, so my research looks at women's professional football in England, but I think more broadly in women's professional football, the contemporary issues that are being addressed, first and foremost, I think, is the professionalisation of sport. So I think there is increasing professionalisation globally. I think what that's meant for women's socio-political rights within football is that it's almost had this ripple effect. So like professionalisation here in England, professionalisation in America, Australia, they are very white Western countries. It's had a ripple effect into like what we see happening in Denmark, Netherlands, New Zealand, for example. Players are becoming, I guess, more empowered to and have the ability to recognise and demonstrate what they believe they should have in terms of like economic remuneration, but also in terms of like facilities, access to facilities, medical care, maternity, all of these gender specific issues that have been raised within the book and people's research more broadly. So I think that's one contemporary issue that's being addressed, i.e. the labour rights that women have within the labour market, which is professional football. I think another key contemporary issue that's being addressed through professionalisation processes is the quality of football. So I think there is that real, I suppose, that old-aged criticism, if you like, of women's football, that they're not fast enough, they're not strong enough. And this is all in comparison to men's football. But what we've actually seen, I suppose, here in England is that over the last 10 plus years that professionalisation has been gaining ground, is that the quality of women's football has improved vastly. You'd only have to look to the figures of World Cups and the Euros of people actually watching the sport, because it's a better spectacle. So I think through professionalisation we can see women gaining more socio-political rights within the sport, in the labour market, and also the increasing quality of the game. And I won't take up too much time. There's obviously other issues that I could talk around, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll pass over to anyone who wants to speak next.
If I can make a contribution to the way forward within the whole context of professionalization, I think for rugby union, the role of World Rugby is crucial. If World Rugby do not set one uniform international standard for the treatment of female players, the situation will not change. If World Rugby, for example, do not allow a situation where affiliated national bodies can willy-nilly withdraw their national 15s or 7s team from key events like the World Cup or the Olympic Games, only then will things begin to change for female players within rugby union across the world. Within the South African context, for example, the key players are obviously the South African Rugby Football, the South African Rugby Union, who controls the women's team, but also the South African Sports Confederation and Olympic Committee. Now, the Olympic Committee control both the national emblem, it controlled the right to tour or to host tours, and it controls also the flow of lottery money that are primarily used for the promotion of sports. For a long time, the male-dominated Olympic Committee, for example, had a so-called standard for participation in mega events like the Olympic Games. And it went like, if a team do not have a realistic chance of winning a medal even though the team might have qualified, we don't send that team. There's no investment there. To the same extent, when they work with the international series in rugby sevens, for example, they qualify for Olympic participation. We had a situation where the female team twice qualified for participation, both in Rio and in Japan. They weren't sent because they had no realistic chance, in the words of the Olympic body. But the critical change has come now. The majority of the current leadership, the new leadership of the National Olympic Confederation, are female. And hopefully that may begin to turn things around for the domestic game. But their efforts will only bear fruit if World Rugby supports the further growth and development and the standardization of conditions of service for female players. As far as rugby league in South Africa is concerned, for example, we are not even at the point where we have female clubs. What about getting to a point of fielding a national rugby league female side? So it's also a matter of what is the role of bodies like the Commonwealth Games Association, where rugby league feature, for example. How do they influence the game development and long-term player development strategies of national bodies? The International Olympic Committee, how do they allow a situation where there is almost a subjective interpretation of their own rules when it comes to qualification? So I think key to the advancement of the female sports project in general lies with the international controlling bodies, which at this point is not playing a consistent role. And sorry for the noise. I'm finding myself in a conference room where some of the organizers just came in because of lack of Wi-Fi close to the Maluti Mountains on the border with Lesotho.
No, please don't worry, Hendrik. Thank you very much for that. I think there's been a question which I actually am gonna, from Rachel Malcolm, that I'm actually going to develop because Tracy's put a nice response to it, and I think it can actually kind of contribute to almost wrapping things up, really. So Rachel's asked fundamentally about player migration, and the example she's provided is the movement of a South African female player into the Premier 15s rugby union tournament in the UK or in England. And I think that notion of player migration is perhaps something that we don't address in the book, but is a fundamental feature of the professionalisation of sport. We definitely see it in men's sport, and it's then subsequently been researched, and Tracy in her thoughtful responses pulled on that. So alongside perhaps discussions of this idea of player migration, and an open question to the panel, are there any issues within the professionalisation of women's sport that we think warrant further investigation, or perhaps as we move through these processes and we see these increasing opportunities, what are going to be the things that we're going to be looking at moving forward? So that's open to anyone who wants to contribute.
I can speak to it from a golf standpoint, because I think it's unique in the sense that the migration is necessary. Like, there is no career for almost all of these golfers without going abroad in some sense, even if that's just on the regular schedule traveling around. There are certain instances where players may be able to stay within Europe, but they've, maybe top 5, 6 on the ladies European tour. And so it's interesting from the standpoint, I think, that for players from Asian countries, experience, as far as the women are concerned, are like rock stars there. We don't experience that, at least in the States. I don't know how it is in European countries, but I mean, these athletes are revered as superstars in their countries. And so when they do come over and play, you know, what would be considered internationally, even though the tour is based in America, yeah, I think it's necessary for them. I don't see negatives from it from that standpoint. I think that maybe down the road, if we look at like burnout, the choices that some women have to make as far as, you know, unfortunately with like families, players will retire to have kids and all the things that men don't have to consider. It's almost exasperated at the women's professional golf level, because for the tour to survive, they have to go to countries like Japan, Korea, they're going to Australia, all over the world. Whereas on the men's tour, there's so much money involved. They can select which tournaments they want to play, and they could play within a 2-hour area of their house and sustain a living, the top players. So I think those will probably be some of the areas that we see. And, you know, I think we saw it with like Lorena Ochoa, Annika Sorensen, players that retire almost in their prime because there's other things that they want to be doing, and the, you know, just the drain that it is to play internationally doesn't warrant or, you know, lend to seeing players play out their full career. So, you know, I'm curious to what it's like in other sports, but that's how it looks from a golf perspective.
Thanks, Robbie.
Cheers, Robbie. I'm just going to answer Hannah's question, and then Al, do you want to wrap up? Okay, so Hannah, talking about professionalisation is often seen as accepted as an endpoint. I think in a straight answer, I would say specifically in football, obviously I can't speak for every other sport. Yes, because I think both players and organisations believe that professionalisation, it's like, we've done it now, can you just crack on and be professional about it? Like, it's kind of like that. And I think for players, it's because if you think about, certainly in the FAWSL, you've got a big proportion of the players who have played as an amateur and now they're playing professional football, and whether that means that they're earning, you know, £50,000 a year or £20,000 a year, it's that symbolic prestige which is attached to being a professional athlete, no matter, you know, what the economics look or financial surrounding it looks like or feels like. So I think for players, professionalisation is an endpoint, and I think, like I said before, there's that narrative of gratefulness, of gratitude that surrounds women's football, that we should not really rock the boat and ask for more, because we've come so far. Look where we've come from. We've come from amateurs, and now we're professionals. So that's in a very applicable player sense. I think for organisations, almost for sure that, you know, it's been a long time coming, this professional game here in England, and more broadly, like professionalisation in Europe and also Western countries, that it's like we've ticked a box now, and that we need to just like get on with it, and that's, you know, remain in the status quo. We don't really want to push men's sport too much. We don't want to have too much commercialisation. We don't want to, you know, all of these narratives and issues that surround women's sport, that professionalisation kind of nips in the bud, if you like. It's kind of like, yeah, we're just professional, and this, you're playing in a professional league. It's like what's happening in the NWSL right now, that players have been coming forward with these sexual allegations for years, and they've brushed it under the carpet because nobody, whether you're in an organisation or whether you're a player, really rocks the boat and wants to ask for more. And that neat box of professionalisation kind of puts a stop to that. So I think it's not only in sport. I think for women in other occupations as well, that are male dominated, which is almost all of them. I think like women are scared to rock the boat and ask for more, but it's about, and I really don't like the word empowering. I'd prefer to talk about education on our socio-political rights as women and as athletes, that we can start to influence and shift kind of like what we think professionalisation should look and feel like.
Thanks, Alex. I'm conscious of time, and of course we've gone over as per this whole seminar. So I think, as much as I don't want to, I think it's important that we wrap it up here. And I know we've got a certain panel member that is probably desperate to go to bed as well, despite being a fantastic contributor. So there are a couple more comments in the the chat box. So Dr. Arif, it would be awesome if you got in touch with Alex and I, and it's something we could pick up for sure. In terms of in the Pakistani context and in Islamic countries, and it's something we've obviously flagged throughout, that we're talking about. This growth in professionalisation is happening in certain places, and it is quite often what might be called your typical Western countries. So I think there's lots of conversation to be had there for sure, and Alex and I would love to pick that up with you. But I would like to take this opportunity to again thank our contributors who have been fantastic. So I hugely appreciate your time and efforts both today and in contributing to the book. And also to those of you that have logged on, I hope that's been useful for you. Please feel free to reach out to either Alex and I on email, social media, etc. And I'm sure our contributors will feel exactly the same about wanting to kind of talk and share more about their research. But thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate your time, and I hope that's been an enjoyable way to spend UK lunchtime. Obviously, for Robbie and Tracy, that's very different. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.